When, in the year 410, a heavy, viscous stillness, thick as the smoke that lingers in lamp-lit sanctuaries, fell over the shattered stones of a once resplendent capital, the very air itself grew bitter with the sorrow of broken hearts and the dry, acrid tang of amphorae burned to ash. It felt as though the ground beneath one's feet still pulsed with the heat of the recent conflagration and bore the faint imprint of shattered vessels, their fractured shapes clinging to the clay like memories refusing to be swept away by time. Slowly, deliberately, as if measuring out the final, inexorable pulses of fate, Alaric's Goths advanced along the cobbled streets. Each footfall rang out in interminable echoes through empty atria and silent halls, where, only yesterday, the voices of senators had mingled with the rustle of scrolls and the ghostly strains of priests' hymns. Even the wind, the ever-youthful companion of the Tiber, now crept through the city with a cautious hush, as if afraid to stir the slumbering specter of history. It drifted among faded banners, peered into cracked capitals, and brushed the dust from porticos with a tentative hand, as though checking whether any spark of life yet endured. And when gold, tapestries, and crystalline chalices vanished into the Goth spoil, they took with them an invisible tapestry of confidence, the stubborn whispered conviction that Rome could not exist without its ramparts and that all the world, obedient as ever, revolved around its 7 hills. Yet even more devastating than that loss was the vanishing of the small, the intimate threads that wove daily life, the familiar creak of wheels along the battered stones of the Via Appia, the indifferent croak of courtyard fountains, the dawn chorus of stalls opening at the Forum, the cheerful clink of copper bowls in the workshops, and, above all, the evening song of nightingales drifting above the Tiber, as though assuring the city that no matter how many times it might fall, it would always rise again, shake off its dust, and turn its face once more to the sky. The city besieged 6 times. Between 536 and 552, Rome was laid under siege 6 times and passed from hand to hand like a heavyweight trophy wrested by merciless combatants. In those years, the city became the arena for the unrelenting conflict between Byzantium and the Ostrogoths, and each fresh siege settled over its ancient stones as a thick veil of dust, mingled with the acrid smoke of burning districts, obscuring the once glorious marble forums. When the first signal fires flared along the walls in the spring of 537, their uneasy glow was mirrored in the stagnant canal waters, and overhead a golden mist curled above the holy domes, an ominous herald of long days of dread. In the hush of night, the wind that crept through shattered arrow slits carried the moan of the wounded and the metallic rasp of drilling teams. Gothic siege engines, like black ships of doom, were ferried to the Tiber's banks, and every hushed whisper of impending famine ricocheted off the ancient columns where scholars and poets had sparred only yesterday. The second siege struck in the blazing summer of 538. The Goths stormed the city, and clouds of cobblestone dust and charred wood ash enveloped its basilicas, transforming them into silent, ghostly silhouettes. The first harbingers of horror emerged in the streets, priests in desecrated vestments and merchants pushing empty wagons, their eyes dimmed of all familiar light. The third and fourth assaults, in 541 and 545, unfolded under the grim specter of starvation and pestilence. The walls themselves seemed gaunt, as if emaciated by relentless hunger, while flocks of black birds circled the broken aqueducts in search of corpses. Each toll of the city's bells grew ever fainter, as though Rome, seeking to conserve its last breath of sound, was unwilling to admit another loss. The fifth siege, renewed by King Totila, proved especially cruel. His warriors seized young nobles from the city's oldest families as hostages, and many lineages vanished without a trace. Their boots thundered through narrow alleys like funeral drums over a tomb, and the city gates, swinging open and shut, sighed with the weary finality of a life's last breath. Finally, the sixth siege culminated in the long-awaited Byzantine triumph, yet the newly won legions could not revive the silent streets. On the fractured steps of the Forum, grass sprang up as though the memory of Rome's grandeur had lost its voice. In the shadowed niches of the baths, the water no longer murmured, and in the desolate arcades there echoed only the hollow plea of forgotten hopes. Even after the last Byzantine cohort receded beyond the horizon, Rome remained a city of wounds, its heart beating no longer to the rhythm of an empire, but whispering instead in the rasp of stone at sunset, a stubborn pulse learning once again how to draw breath. When the Forum became Pasture. By the early 9th century, under the cloak of dawn's first silvery mist that curled through the hollows of ancient Rhonum, when the night's chill still lingered in the air and dewdrops gleamed on every blade of grass, the once majestic valley of the Forum had become a boundless sea of lush, verdant turf. Here on the Campo Vaccino, the cow pasture, it felt as if one had stepped into a living mirage. Weary herds of cattle and goats wandered among the ruins, contentedly grazing the cool grass where senators once toasted and sacred rites once rang out. Tall marble columns, which had once soared toward the sky, now stood as silent sentinels of memory. Their ivy-clad capitals quivered in the gentle breeze, and between the arches taut lines of rope swayed with damp laundry, humming a soft, homely lullaby. Wisps of smoke from itinerant craftsmen's stalls drifted above the fallen stones, mingling with the scent of freshly cut grass and the bitter whisper of ancient marble. The worn steps of long-forgotten temples were gradually chipped away by the heavy blows of stone-cutters' axes, each shard of marble absorbing the metallic tremor as if to preserve in its heart a fragment of former splendor, destined later to become the foundation of new towers. Every time a blacksmith's hammer flung a shower of sparks, its ringing echo swept through the empty portals and was answered by the faint laughter of a shepherd lighting his fire beside a crumbling aqueduct. The wind itself, as though slicing through the age-long slumber of those walls, brushed away the last shavings of time from the shattered stone and carried them down to the river, where villagers at dawn washed bundles of grass in their boats and filled pitchers with crystal water. In this way, Rome led a double life. The low murmur of shepherds' voices reverberated off basilica fragments, and the clink of basins used to feed beggars joined the symphony of daybreak, as though the entire city breathed on, unaware that its memories of past greatness were fading, making room instead for the simple, almost primeval rhythm of life, the click of hooves, the rustle of grass, and the faint rustlings of hope sprouting through the cracks of stone. A forest of towers, barons, and their wars. At the turn of the 11th and 12th centuries, as the sun tilted toward the horizon and the long day glowed with molten copper, Rome's skyline was pierced by hundreds of stone pikes, sharp and proud as the spears of ancient gladiators. The great houses of Orsini, Colonna, Frangipani, and other noble clans raised these towers not merely as strongholds, but as colossal emblems of family glory. Each slender shaft, thrust up from the heart of a district like a pencil ripped from the earth, sketched its lineage's pride against the sky. When the sunset tide poured across the heavens in waves of purple and gold, each tower's narrow embrasure glimmered with the living fire of torches, as if stars had been coaxed down to dance upon the old roofs. From the west came the faint sweetness of burning wax and spicy incense, From the east, the rumble of hammers and the steady roar of forges where warriors heated their blades for yet another clash. Below, at the base of marble foundations, narrow lanes twisted through a half-light, broken only by bright window fires. Here, maids hung freshly washed linen on lines that fluttered like pale banners, and townsfolk traded whispered rumors of looming feuds. From within the towers themselves drifted the muted voices of baronesses and the clear laughter of children playing among the stone slabs. These lofty homes were vessels not only of arms, but also of bread, of wine, and of the unhurried tales that elders told of days long past. Each of these colossal stone monoliths served three roles at once: impregnable vaults for weapons and provisions, sanctuaries for sprawling kinship networks, and elevated thrones from which to display power. The taller the tower soared, the more its lord felt invincible, so much so that the very fabric of the city seemed to bend to their will, preserving in its stony entrails the memory of revived ambitions. And though the wind, wandering among the upper tiers, whispered of the fragility of stone and the inexorable march of time, Roman barons stood vigil in their battlements, their lands, their titles, and their fates entwined in the angles of those towering walls, where every jutting corner and narrow-arched niche bore witness to an endless contest of ambition and authority. In that forest of stone giants, every shadow might conceal an ally or a rival, and every spire held the promise of a new and altogether different war. The duel of Pope and Emperor. From the mid-11th century onward, the Eternal City became a stage for drama as fierce as any ancient gladiatorial contest. Pope Gregory VII and Emperor Henry IV locked themselves in a mortal struggle over the right to invest bishops. Rome itself, carved by narrow alleys and shadowed by the vast basilicas, transformed into a living theater of intrigue, crimson anathemas, and whispered vows upon the crosses. Thin rays of dawn light slid across the painted cathedral doors when, in 1075, Gregory issued his ban on lay investiture, the very ignoble knot that tore away the veils hiding unnamed conspiracies. Along the echoing cobbles of the Via Pagana, sealed letters, stamped with imperial wax, foretold excommunication and reminded all that only the Pope bestows grace, and only he decides to whom men must serve. In secluded courtyards beneath marble statuary, cardinals conspired as vague suspicions took shape and rumors of Roman factions swirled, ready to converge upon the open doors of the Lateran Palace. Then, in the spring of 1076, Henry moved north like a giant shadow. Gathering his bishops at Worms, he declared the Pope deposed. Salvos of verbal firestorm whistled through vaulted halls until Gregory retaliated, excommunicating Henry and releasing his vassals from every oath of fealty by monks' prayers and to the roar of a jubilant crowd echoing down dusty streets. In the winter of 1077, Henry, barefoot, on bended knee, weeping over his sins, made his penitential pilgrimage to the walls of Canosso, lying in snow for 3 days of utter humiliation. The city held its breath. Would the Pope grant mercy? Yet Gregory lingered, wielding his cold authority, and in that drawn-out pause, new imperial campaigns against Italy were already stirring. Finally, in 1084, Henry burst into Rome like a storm, his knights sweeping in martial array through the streets. In the dark corridors of the papal palace, where secret charters had only yesterday whispered and vestments hung untouched, the flash of swords lit the gloom. The emperor's nominee took the throne, and the great basilicas rang with the tread of boots and the murmured prayers of suffering Romans. Only then, when it seemed the last ray of papal power had flickered out, did the Normans, Robert Guiscard's warriors, arrive from the southern seas. They landed at the Tiber, stormed through barricades, and brought the clarion call of relief to Castel Sant'Angelo. Their axes spared neither foe nor bystander, and the charred portals of churches stood mute witness to the savagery that respected neither name nor rank. The streets echoed with the cries of a city laid waste, while ash and the screech of melting shields etched a grim new chapter upon the stones. Proof that here, at the crossroads of secular might and sacred authority, every anathema and every thrust of the blade shaped the destiny of generations. Pilgrims and the economy of salvation. From the moment the first Jubilee was proclaimed in 1300, Rome became a seething cauldron of piety and commerce. Endless streams of barefoot pilgrims in scuffed sandals pressed like slow rivers along the age-worn paths leading to basilica gates, where the sacred relics of apostles lay hidden in half-light. Their footsteps fell in muffled drum beats upon the marble slabs, lending hand-hewn by barbarians and Byzantines alike, which seemed to remember every whispered prayer and every trembling breath of faith. Along the narrow lanes that fanned out from those holy thresholds, merchants pitched brilliant tents weighed down by bursting clusters of grapes and baskets brimming with fragrant herbs. Taverns buzzed like beehives at the height of honey gathering, their voices rising in an endless hum. Wine merchants displaying bottles of heady Burgundy to hooded monks. Spice traders unrolling bundles of frankincense and myrrh. Clothiers hawking leather belts and heavy woolen cloaks. The air itself became a tapestry of aroma, rich mutton stew mingling with braised beef, warm cinnamon and pungent clove, resinous incense smoke, and the tang of wine-soaked bread, each scent weaving into the next to create a sumptuous feast for the senses. At dawn, as the first pale rays kissed the fountain basins, the ring of silver and gold coins in the money-changers' scales drowned out even the clarion call of the church bells. Every splash of coin into a wooden bowl spoke of invisible threads, binding rich and poor, pilgrim and merchant, into the great economy of salvation. Money changers, clutching leather pouches heavy with denarii, bent over their scales in tireless devotion, their eyes glinting like a scarlet sea of profit. Pilgrims, careful to soothe blistered feet with olive oil, knelt to press calloused hands against the cold stone of altars and the painted faces of saints. In those hushed moments, the clamor of the marketplace fell away, and only the low murmur of grateful prayers filled the air. Day after day, inns and hostels brimmed with fresh arrivals, lone hermits with bound bundles over their shoulders, peasants in threadbare tunics, townsfolk in coarse service cloth, all paid for lodging, repast, and the promise of blessing, participating unwittingly in an unseen balance of expenditures and alms. Monastic estates flourished on tithes exacted from every arrival, while enterprising residents of the winding neighborhoods prospered by mending scalded cauldrons and replacing worn soles in weary pilgrim sandals. And so, amid the swirl of scents, sounds, and ceaseless movement, the tide of the faithful became more than a river of bodies and voices. It became the very engine of the economy of salvation, where every donated coin, every humble offering placed before a shrine, reverberated through the eternal city's stone walls and wove itself into the endless tapestry of its history. Cola di Rienzo, Tribune of legend. When in May 1347, the mild-mannered clerk Nicola di Lorenzo Gabrini, better known as Cola di Rienzo, mounted the makeshift rostrum on the Capitoline hill, it seemed as though the ghostly shadows of long-slumbering ancient deities had stirred in the crumbling stones and reached toward a fresh wind of change. In that pre-dawn hour, as the first golden rays set the banners aflame with light, the soaring colonnades of the Forum thrummed like the strings of a lyre, eager to resonate with each utterance of his voice. Among the assembly rallied for justice, eyes glowed with hope, weathered elders who still remembered the Republic's former glory, and earnest youths in homespun tunics, their hearts kindled by the promise of newly awakened liberty. Rienzo's brief rule burst forth like fireworks over the old ruins. With a single decisive edict, he banned duels, threatening exile and infamy to those who longed for bloodshed, severing the echoes of a barbarous past. Under his mandate, the murky back alleys of power were thrust into the light. Magistrates, whose purses had swelled from unjust levies, found themselves exposed before the citizenry, their numbers dwindling, while suspect charters, woven like guilt-laden cobwebs, were cast ceremoniously onto bonfires in the piazza. Grand processions unfurled richly colored carpets along the arcades, recalling ancient pageantry. Youths bore laurel wreaths overhead, maidens in white tunics scattered petals like confetti, and every measured step along those marble corridors struck an echo of bygone magnificence. Yet behind this dazzling spectacle lay a darker Roman stage, a tangled maze of baronial palaces and the chill, echoing corridors of the papal curia. Beneath those vaulted ceilings, serpentine whispers wove conspiracies. Cardinals draped in purple plotted in secrecy, and the great houses of Orsini and Colonna, their jeweled rings glinting, readied themselves to unseat the people's tribune, whose lofty speeches dared challenge centuries of entrenched authority. When at last the bell of St. Peter tolled to mark the final of Rienzo's decrees, the once sanguine Romans, worn thin by levies and hollow promises, assembled at the creaking staircases of their nobles' mansions, not in shouts of praise, but in a storm of anger. The crowd that had once cried, "Long live the Tribune," now unleashed its fury upon the fallen hero. The marble slabs of the Capitoline, recently quivering under triumphant feet, lay obscured by the thunderous march of betrayal. The ancestral voices that had echoed so vividly in his orations fell silent, and the memory of his final cry dissolved among the columns like foam on a noonday wave, leaving behind only empty paving stones to guard the memory of that fleeting spark of hope for a reborn republic. Avignon Captivity and Return. From 1309 until 1377, Rome seemed to lose its very head and drift into a shifting haze of oblivion. 7 successive popes took up residence in French Avignon, while the sacred halls of the Vatican stood silent and still, like crystal vessels drained of life's waters. A ghostly wind, slipping through the basilica's darkened windows, whispered of emptiness. Bells went unheard in the hush, and along deserted streets, every echo of footsteps seemed the tread of priests long gone. On the piazzas that once thronged with clergy and faithful, wandering minstrels now performed to drum beats and lute strings, striving in vain to lift the spirits of a starved nobility. Their voices, solitary soldiers in a battle against despair, sometimes only underscored its relentless pulse. Before the closed gates of the papal palaces, blind beggars scraped for fallen coins, their outstretched hands chasing the last gleams of hope as if trying to grasp the vanished mercy of long-faded blessings. At last, on a spring morning in 1377, as if heralded by the dawn itself, the papacy returned beneath St. Peter's vaulted roofs, and the colorful tents of merchants gave way to a new chorus of bells. A fresh sound rang out, hammers striking stone and chisels singing on marble, as master masons and architects assembled like an orchestra to awaken the aging walls. Stone by stone, porticos were remade, gates swung open in exultant welcome, and the piazza's sands were scored by the hurried feet of returning crowds. And so, like a mythic phoenix, the city rose from the ashes of its forgotten glory. Roofs gleamed with crimson tiles, domes glittered in the sun, and the labyrinth of streets once more became the stage for an endless dance of worshippers, craftsmen, and pilgrims, together weaving in a grand circle of faith and toil the new visage of the Christian world's heart. Saracens on the Tiber and at Garigliano. As early as the 10th century, the broad floodplains of the Tiber and the steep banks of Lazio would flare with alien fire. Nomadic bands of Saracens, like hungry shadows, would roll forth from the boundless steppes, ravage the riverside villages, and vanish with the hiss of retreating hooves beyond the hills. The monasteries, hidden in the dark ravines of Subiaco, once alive with the rustle of parchment and the scent of incense, fell silent, their vaulted libraries creaking with dust, and their empty cells stirred only by filaments of forgotten cobweb. In the hamlets where church bells once rang and peasant laughter rose on the morning air, a stifling hush now reigned. Rooftops seemed to whisper of recent flames, and frightened shepherds wandered the broken roads, clutching their wounded flocks to their chests. The wind, sweeping across the deserted meadows, carried the acrid tang of charred wood and scorched earth, a grim reminder of the swift raids that allowed not a single moment's respite. Yet in 916, the people's patience finally snapped. Pope John X, long withdrawn to private hermitages, stepped into the light and called upon the princes of Campania, Sorrento, and Amalfi, the formidable navies of the maritime republics, Lombard warlords, and Byzantine commanders. With a solemn sign of the cross, he gathered beneath his banner a diverse host, knights in gleaming armor, nimble horsemen, seasoned archers, and oarsmen, all united in a single purpose, to form a living rampart between tranquil hills and the plundering galleys of the invaders. As the Tiber's surge churned into foaming waves at the shore, these allied forces marched to meet the foe, until, on the sands of Garigliano, the decisive clash was joined. Armies collided in a whirlwind of lances, and the ring of steel drowned out the river's bitter roar. Beneath a red-hued sunset, shields blazed and tunics flared, and cries of "For the Pope!" and "For our land's freedom" rose together in a mighty battle hymn that cleaved through the rolling hills. When the last Saracen detachment was driven into the marshes and shattered, dawn broke in unyielding silence. Scattered arrow shafts lay upon dew-slick grass, and monks gathered in measured rows to chant, their voices trembling with gratitude, an unending Te Deum and Gloria in Excelsis. Bells pealed once more across the valley, their sound ascending to the heavens like showers of sacred benediction. The victory at Garigliano became a foundation stone. Fortified towns rebuilt their walls, riverside mills sprang to life again, and in the cells of Subiaco, lamps were rekindled and vibrant choirs resumed their songs. Though sporadic raids still haunted the dark nights, the memory of that glorious victory united the peoples of Lazio in a single bond. Over the ruined ramparts, the wooded hills, and the wide Tiber waters shone a renewed hope for peace, gifted by the courage of shepherd soldiers and the resolve of the Church's champion. Black Death and Empty Homes. In the grim year of 1348, when the inky shadow of the plague swept down upon Rome, the city seemed to slip into the disorienting haze of a cursed dream. Narrow streets, once alive with chatter and laughter, became interminable corridors of anguish, littered with rickety stretchers that groaned under the weight of trembling carts. Each rumble over the cobblestones echoed like a funeral drum, and the pervasive quiver of terror in the air became the city's new heavy heartbeat, as though the very soul of Rome was shuddering beneath the onslaught of an invisible scourge. Within the towering, time-worn vaults of the basilicas, the low, sonorous intonations of mercy psalms rose and fell like a mournful tide, resonating through the candlelit gloom. Yet even this sacred music was tainted by the acrid bite of burning beeswax and the sharp undertones of spilt red wine, offered as a futile balm against the inexorable pangs of mortality. The scent of scorched wick and fermented grape clung to the cold stone, weaving a tapestry of despair that hung in every whispered prayer. Above the silent piazzas, the houses stood as mute sentinels, hollow, hushed giants guarding empty courtyards where only the wind dared to wander. Its lament, drawn through broken doorways and collapsed arches, sounded like the sorrowful wail of a lost spirit, haunting the darkened corridors where once voices had rang. On the steep climbs to distant chapels, figures moved like ghosts beneath veils of incense, hands pressed to cracked lips, searching for absolution as each breath quivered with dread. Seasons turned, and at last the plague's dreadful scythe lifted. In the ragged chinks of shuttered windows, the first pale glimmers of hope filtered through. Rome, gaunt and wearied, rose from its knees like an aged wanderer gathering strength. Hammers and chisels summoned sparks against fractured beams, as master stonemasons and artisans coaxed life back into shattered walls. Fresh mortar blossomed in the seams of restored foundations, and across once barren squares, the steady cadence of working feet reclaimed the silence. The lesson carved by the Black Death into the heart of the eternal city was immutable. Even when darkness threatens to snuff out hope itself, Rome endures. From the ashes of its despair, it rebuilds, brick by ancient brick, restoring not only its hallowed dwellings, but the resilient spirit of its people, like a phoenix blazing defiantly against the tides of time. Epilogue The Thunder of 1527. On the dawn of May 6, 1527, a choking cloud of dust and grit rose from the battered ramparts of Rome in such overwhelming volume that it swallowed the thunderous crack of snapping crossbow bolts and turned the city into a silent, struggling breath. That dust, fine as powdered bone, hung in the air like a living shroud, dimming the pale morning light and blotting out the proud outlines of palaces and temples. Faint slashes of sunlight pierced the haze in mottled shafts, illuminating splintered beams and charred masonry, as though accusing the city itself of some terrible complicity in its own undoing. Every ravaged dwelling, its shutters torn off and doors flung wide in desperate flight, resembled a monumental gravestone carved by war. Inside those ruined chambers, the only music was the mournful hiss of wind spiraling through shattered archways and the soggy plop of rain pooling in fractured courtyards where children once ran at play. The great basilicas, whose soaring domes once lifted hearts toward heaven, stood broken and bowed, their portals littered with marble shards and their underground crypts echoing the hollow clang of collapsed bells, as if the sacred voices themselves had been struck mute. Amid this apocalyptic tableau, the bawling of unchecked mercenaries merged with the hoarse wails of the bereft, crafting a final, savage movement in the waning symphony of the Middle Ages. News of Rome's fall, her altars desecrated, her sanctuaries looted, shook the marble halls of Europe's courts, shattering the illusion that the Holy City was impregnable. Yet out of this smothering darkness emerged an invisible current of renewal. The shock of devastation became the forge for a counter-reformation that swept across Christendom, its fervent zeal kindled by the memory of desecration. Pope Clement VII, who had fled for refuge to the grim heights of Castel Sant'Angelo, later rallied his scattered flock, channeling grief into an outpouring of spiritual and artistic revival. Under his guidance, battered churches were rebuilt on loftier foundations. New religious orders sprang to life in a fervor of piety, and commissioned frescoes and altarpieces surged with the renewed devotion and rigor. From the hammer blows that rang through reorganized workshops to the first clear notes of violin rebuking the still lingering silence, a transformed Rome slowly re-emerged, a city no longer sheltering under old alliances, but determined to preserve and magnify its eternal soul. In the rebound from that terrible thunder, the Renaissance itself shifted its course. Broken palace skeletons were clothed in gleaming travertine and graceful columns. Ruined piazzas were swept clean and filled with the measured rhythms of skilled artisans. And so, in the grand metamorphosis from chaos to creation, the greatest lesson of May 6, 1527 endured. Even when darkness descends in a cyclone of blood and dust, the ashes of destruction can be the very embers that ignite a new, undying dream.